Everyone here is playing a part. X marks the spot.
I can't believe I'm going to say this, but the Enola Holmes movies have turned out to be much more exciting than the books. Don't get me wrong, the books are great, but somehow the films have added intricate layers that make them more suitable for a wider audience as well. Also, Millie Bobby Brown has been glorious in portraying the titular character, and ever since 2020, she's taken us on multiple Victorian journeys as Sherlock's little sister and proved that the Holmes name could belong as much to a young girl as to her world-famous brother. Now, I know these movies aren't exactly flawless, but somehow I've always found them to be extremely enjoyable popcorn flicks. However, one thing that's always there while adapting books into films is the differences between the two. The three Enola Holmes movies, with the latest one dropping just a couple of days ago, also have several differences from their source material novels, and while I think the creative liberties worked pretty well, we want to hear your thoughts in the comment section after we go through the major ones. It's a fun list, and we had fun making this video, so let's get right into it without wasting another second. Enola's escape. In the movie, Enola found out that her mother, played by none other than Helena Bonham Carter, was missing on her 16th birthday. However, she had left her daughter some money and clues to solve the mystery of her disappearance, and following a clue, she found that money with a message that read, "Our future is up to us." Enola then disguised herself as a boy and escaped her brothers to board a train to London. Now, some people consider this a major plot hole because how on earth could Sherlock Holmes not anticipate that she was going to flee? And yeah, that's a valid point, no matter how funny it was to watch, because logic kinda took a back seat here. In the book titled The Case of the Missing Marquess, an Enola Holmes mystery by Nancy Springer, Enola fled to avoid being sent to a strict boarding school by her brothers, Sherlock and Mycroft, by sneaking away while visiting her father's grave. She then rode her bicycle to a train station and boarded a train disguised as a fully grown grieving widow. And yeah, that makes a little bit more sense than Enola just slipping away right under her brothers' noses.
The world was not one of them. And yet, here I am.
Boarding school. Speaking of boarding school, this was one of the bigger changes they made to the movie. In the film, Enola did end up in a finishing school because Mycroft was adamant that Enola needed to attend a proper school so that she could become both educated and ladylike enough to get a suitable husband and not embarrass him. At the school, she meets Miss Harrison, and that's when things got truly difficult for her. Miss Harrison lectured her on what should and should not be done, and when Enola did not meet expectations in terms of her performance or behavior, Miss Harrison revealed that she knew Enola's mother and that she had been challenging too. In fact, the school played such a huge part in the movie that Enola escaped from there with the help of Tewkesbury. In the book, Enola never even made it to the boarding school and escaped before she was ever sent there.
She insisted on it, in fact.
Enola's age. As I said, Enola learned about her mother's disappearance on her 16th birthday, but that actually made her 2 years older than her book counterpart, whose story kicked off with Enola celebrating her 14th birthday. However, this change seemed more like a practical choice than a creative one, because Millie Bobby Brown was already famous for her portrayal of Eleven on Stranger Things and had already grown up on screen. Moreover, Brown was 16 when the film was released, and it obviously seemed easier to have her play that age than to lower it to 14. 16 was a more believable age for viewers, especially because Lestrade described her as a young woman no more than 20. When they aged Enola up, the filmmakers decided to do the same thing with Tewkesbury. While he was only 12 in the novel, the movie depicted him as a teenager closer to Enola's age.
Deductive thinker. My genius brother.
Sherlock working alone. Well, I couldn't have been happier to see Henry Cavill stepping into Sherlock Holmes' shoes. I did miss Watson. Unfortunately, Dr. John Watson doesn't appear in the first movie, and Sherlock largely operated alone within that story. This was established further by Detective Lestrade, who confronted Enola by saying Sherlock Holmes always works alone when she tried to convince him that she was working for her brother. However, Springer actually wrote the exact opposite, which might hit closer to home for Sherlock Holmes fans. In the book, Sherlock was already working with his associate Watson, and Enola even referred to Watson's published accounts while trying to understand the brother she barely knew. Once Netflix decided to greenlight the sequel, it introduced Watson at the end of the second movie, and by the third one, he became an active participant in the story.
I was rather a fan of word games.
On your marks,
Get set.
go.
Enola's relationship with her mother. Okay, Enola and her mother Eudora shared a pretty close bond in the movie where the latter would homeschool her and teach her everything, probably a lot more than what conventional schools had to offer. She practically grew up without knowing her father and barely knew her brothers either, but Eudora always taught her that privacy was of the highest virtue. In fact, right from the beginning, Enola mentioned in the opening voiceover that she and her mother were very close, and even when her mother reminded her that Enola would do very well on her own, she told the audience that she and her mother were always together. However, that didn't really apply in the novel. On page, Enola would spend most of her time alone, exploring the grounds of the estate and reading, while her mother spent much of her time painting and pursuing her own interests. It's true that her mother taught her various skills like ciphers, although jujitsu was primarily added in by the movie, but the two shared something of a distant and strained relationship because Enola believed she was a source of social embarrassment for her, while Eudora was eccentric and often neglectful, leaving Enola to her own devices.
I'm looking for Eudora Holmes.
Enola?
Edith's character was crafted for the movie. As surprising as this may be, Edith Grayston was never mentioned in the book. Yes, Sherlock did investigate Eudora's associates and activities, but Edith's role in a secret group of women seeking to change society, and her being a London tea house owner who secretly operated martial arts training classes for women, well, that stuff was never penned by Springer. And honestly, this is where the movie did it better because Edith was easily one of the most fascinating characters in the movie. Thankfully, on screen, she got much more time when Enola visited her because she remembered Edith's address as a place from which Eudora received correspondence. Sherlock too visited Edith in the movie after following a trail of clues involving soot in the fireplace.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
The plot about the murderous grandmother. Firstly, I want to say sorry to Grandma for getting annoyed and making faces when she wouldn't let me eat the raw cookie dough or touch a button just to see what it did. I mean, Tewkesbury had a grandmother who hatched a grand scheme to get him murdered, for God's sake. Yep, the movie gave us the Dowager Lady Basilweather as Tewkesbury's grandmother, who conspired to have her progressive son and grandson killed to prevent them from supporting political reform that would expand voting rights. Thankfully, the murderous grandmother was restricted to the movie because Springer didn't create anything so sinister, and in the original story, although Tewkie hated being coddled and treated like a baby, he didn't have a grandmother trying to put him in the grave. He dreamt of running away to sea and eventually traveled towards London, where two men kidnapped him to demand ransom from his family. But the movie raised the stakes by incorporating this plotline and endangering the lives of both Enola and Tewkesbury.
My mistake. I should have warned you.
Caval's Sherlock is very different from what Springer wrote. Nancy Springer depicted the ever-popular detective as someone who had a low opinion of women and often talked about their untrustworthiness, irrationality, and the innate untidiness of their minds. He even suggested that his sister Enola had limited cranial capacity. Book Sherlock also never really recollected memories of Enola's childhood or her pinecone dog Dash in the same way he did in the film. But Henry Cavill made it clear in interviews that his Sherlock would diverge from what he called the traditional misogynistic genius we're familiar with, and explained that Enola softens him and opens up his heart. By portraying Sherlock as more compassionate towards Enola, the film gives him, in Henry Cavill's words, more warmth, kindness, and humanity. His growing admiration for his sister was evident when he told her, "You've become quite the detective, Enola." The softer characterization of Sherlock also created a stronger contrast with Mycroft, because in the novel, both brothers were similarly stern and dismissive of Enola. Neither of them approved of their mother Eudora's unconventional lifestyle or the way she brought Enola up. While the books hinted at similarities between Sherlock and Enola, with her occasionally considering imitating his methods, the movie leaned more heavily into their connection, portraying them as two peas in a pod, as Cavill described it. The adaptation also has Sherlock eventually wanting to become Enola's guardian, significantly hastening the development of his respect for her, which didn't occur in the same way until much later in Nancy Springer's original 6-book arc. In 2022, Enola Holmes 2 dropped, and unlike the first film, it wasn't a direct adaptation of Nancy Springer's second novel, The Case of the Left-Handed Lady. It borrowed characters and broad ideas from the book series, but created a largely original mystery loosely inspired by the real-life Match Girls' strike of 1888. Just like the first film, this Netflix adaptation introduced some major changes. Eudora's story was very different in the movie. In the follow-up film, Enola had opened her own detective agency while Eudora was still on the run. However, Enola's path crossed again with her mother and Edith when Sherlock reached out to them while Enola was being taken to prison. Edith and Eudora staged a breakout to break Enola free. While riding away, they used smoke bombs to get the chasing officers off their trail, and Enola even discussed her current case with Eudora after she learned that the girls at the match factory were dying from what was allegedly typhus. Grail pursued them and caused their carriage to crash. He even attempted to have all three of them arrested, but together they kicked his butt and got away again. Enola then tearfully bid Eudora goodbye so she could get back to her mission. In the original novels, however, Eudora didn't have such a prominent role after leaving home. Enola concluded that her mother had left to live freely, possibly among Romani people, and Eudora communicated with her indirectly through coded messages rather than personally reuniting with her during these early cases. Turns out, viewers absolutely loved this entirely rewritten subplot because we wanted to know more about what happened to Eudora, and seeing her threads tying back to Enola was pretty satisfying. Enola's detective agency. We also really appreciated how the movies gave Enola stronger public agency and portrayed her as this feminist who broke socio-cultural norms unapologetically. And one of the biggest examples of that is her detective agency, which she named the Enola Holmes Detective Agency. The makers focused on her struggling to establish herself as a capable investigator amidst the rampant sexism in Victorian London. Moreover, she was too young to be taken seriously by her clients and almost shut down her business, if not for the poor matchstick girl Bessie who offered her a new case. Nancy Springer, on the other hand, chose to throw light on Enola's cleverness as she worked her way around the restrictions of society, and that's exactly why the detective agency she opened in the books didn't carry her name. When she set up an office to rival Sherlock, she was still hiding from him and Mycroft, always wearing a disguise and using the pseudonym Ivy Meschel. On top of that, she didn't even publicly pose as the detective. Rather, she created a fictional male investigator named Dr. Ragostin and posed as his secretary. Enola and Sherlock's arc. Sherlock and Enola's relationship in Enola Holmes 2 was another major departure from the case of the left-handed lady and the broader early book storyline. In the book, Enola was still on the run from her older brothers after the events of the first novel. Sherlock continued trying to track her down, but Enola always managed to stay one step ahead by using false identities and coded messages. Although there are several moments in the book where Sherlock appears, the siblings never work together as openly as they do in the movie because Enola wants to preserve her independence by staying hidden. But in the movie, Sherlock and Enola resolve much of their conflict by the end, although the beginning saw him discovering that Enola was living and working in London. He even began to respect Enola's intelligence and penchant for solving crimes, and accepted her wish to live life according to her own rules. And if you think about it, it's actually good that the sequel didn't repeat the same cat-and-mouse chase and instead focused on a fresh dynamic between the Holmes siblings. Sherlock and Enola's relationship evolved organically, and he became more of an ally than an obstacle for Enola. Tewkesbury's return. Tewkesbury, or Tewkey as Enola called him in the book, did not make an appearance in the second novel, and according to the book's narrative, it made sense. Tewkesbury was actually 2 years younger than Enola in Nancy Springer's novel, and therefore wasn't a valid romantic interest for her. However, since the movie had already worked its way around that age gap, it only made sense for Tewkesbury to become a recurring character and for the films to focus on the subplot of their blooming love. Plus, Louis Partridge got a whole lot of appreciation for his performance, and his chemistry with Millie Bobby Brown was delightful. And that's exactly why we saw him return in Enola Holmes 2 and become her primary love interest. Also, we don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that Tewkesbury has sometimes functioned as a Watson-like figure for Enola Holmes, and works great for the audience too because time and again, he asks Enola to explain herself when she demonstrates her detective skills. The very case Enola solved differed from the book. Sure, the movie borrowed some elements and characters from Nancy Springer's wider Enola Holmes series, but the very essence of the case Enola solved differed greatly from the case of the left-handed lady. In that book, the case Enola took revolved around the disappearance of a young noblewoman, Lady Cecily Alistair. She was the topic of controversy for apparently having an interest in a shopkeeper's son far below her social status. However, she wasn't found with him, and that sparked Enola's interest in searching for her. The movie, however, changed the very core of the story by centering it around a working-class match girl and introducing a massive fictional conspiracy that was loosely based on the real-life match girls' strike of 1888. The third movie, Enola Holmes 3, finally dropped on July 1st, 2026, and we see Enola and Tewkesbury's love evolve to a stage where the two are about to get married. However, the bride gets caught up in a case about the kidnapping of her own brother, Sherlock. The movie borrows a central idea from Springer's The Case of the Bizarre Bouquets, in which someone close to Sherlock disappears, but it otherwise creates a substantially different story involving Malta, international conspiracies, and explosive action. Once again, the movie strayed from its source material, and here are the biggest differences. It's not Sherlock who got kidnapped. I guess we know by now that it's a trademark for Enola Holmes films to change major plot lines from the original books, and in the third movie as well, the makers altered the very person who got kidnapped and give Enola a case to solve while she should have been at her wedding. In the novel, it was actually Dr. John Watson who disappeared under unexplained circumstances and had to be found by Enola through her knowledge of Victorian flower symbolism. The book thus progressed as a classic detective story with puzzles and subtle clues, which had been traded for a more action-filled scenario fraught with physical danger. Since Sherlock became the victim here, the movie became much more personal for Enola, while Watson instead became one of her allies in solving the case. The film's creators have not stated that saving Watson would inherently have been less exciting than saving Sherlock, so that remains an interpretation rather than a confirmed reason for the change. But hey, the fact that Enola managed to crack the case and bring her brother back strengthened her character and skills because it was Sherlock Holmes she was saving. And, once again, Sherlock realized how goddamn brilliant his sister was, which actually was a pretty heartwarming moment. The movie expanded the geographical range. The events in The Case of the Bizarre Bouquets originally unfolded in a much more intimate and geographically limited setting, taking place in and around London. But from the very beginning of the movie, it became clear that the filmmakers were expanding the region because Enola's wedding was set in Malta, and Sherlock left references that drew Enola into a wider international mystery. That immediately made Enola Holmes 3 more of an international adventure thriller, and as a result, book readers may miss some of the novel's quieter deductions and clever flower-based clues, which were replaced or supplemented with criminal organizations, physical confrontations, and major explosions. Moriarty's return was created for the film. The villains in Springer's third novel were people connected to Watson's abduction and represented cruelty, control, and corruption within Victorian society. Professor Moriarty did not appear as the mastermind behind that book's mystery. By bringing the franchise's version of Moriarty back, the film instantly gave us an enemy we already knew and portrayed the criminal mastermind as someone continuing to work from the shadows. Moriarty's return also allowed the franchise to connect the second and third films into a larger narrative rather than treating the third story as a completely isolated case. Enola Holmes 3 changed the very ambiance and energy of the story, and even the action sequences felt extremely different from the patient detective work of the novel. We all knew that Philip Barantini would be taking a very different path from previous director Harry Bradbeer and his approach to the first two Enola Holmes movies, but sometimes it becomes a little too much for book nerds. Personally, I found the films entertaining, but there are some places where even I believe they should have remained a little more faithful to the source material. Anyways, that's all we got for you this time, guys. If you enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed making it, don't forget to hit that bell icon and like and subscribe to see more videos like this. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see ya in the next one. Bye for now.